historical education by saying, long time will be required for the emancipation of this country. The cultivation of harvesting of man with old habits and instincts should be stopped. The 7 layers of thick soil should be removed, and after that, it cultivation of new man can be accomplished. They only it will be beneficial to the country. It is the explanation of Vidyasagar on our country. So this present time also our same situation is running. So we must be follow the line of Vidyasagar on our education, society, ethics, culture, morality also. Okay. Thanks a lot to all the sir, madam, and participants. Thank you.
Sushnata, you are muted.
Sushnata, you're muted.
I'm sorry, sorry. It's fine. Okay, so thank you, Rajendra, for that informative and insightful talk. Now we'll move on to the actual meeting, and I'll lay out how we are going about the meeting. How we'll do it is we'll have a 30-minute session for some invited opinions from people that I have personally invited to attend this meeting today, and then we'll have an invited talk at length from Professor Soumitra Banerjee. So to begin the interactive session, we'll start with Anindita ma'am. Uh, why I have called her here is because I know her to have read the NAP in detail, even when it was a draft, and she was one of the many people who had probably written back to the government with some suggestions on things that she felt were not right about the draft NAP when it was published back in 2019. Uh, she is also the co-chair of Global Young Academy. She is the founding chair of INEAS, or Indian National Young Academy of Science. She is the associate dean of international relations and outreach in ISA Kolkata, and she's also the mother of 2 children. So I'll ask her to briefly speak on the reforms that have been suggested in terms of school education in this policy, and specifically ask her on what she had written back to the government with what suggestions she had on the policy.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks, Shushna. So I will try to be brief. I think many of us have been reading about these issues in the newspaper, that one of the main things that they have put in the national education policy. First, let me tell you what I think are very nice about it, that they are thinking of holistic education. They are thinking of bringing back dropouts from the system back into the system. They are considering breaking down silos and breaking down the boundaries between disciplines, and increasing the stress on education in arts, culture, and various vocational models at the school level, which is nice as a thought process. Now, let me tell you what I thought was a problem, and this is also something which I had commented on, but of course, none of the comments I see have anywhere gone anywhere in the final policy. That's a different point. So, if I look at the major shift that is happening in the current format, is now they have a 3+5. Uh, so pre-primary and then primary, and then but class 3 to class 8 as a 5 year, and then 9, 10, 11, 12 again broken into 2+2. So this is the structure they're trying to bring in, and the emphasis on exams will be reduced, and the emphasis on continuous learning assessment will be increased, which is again very nice. But then what I feel is problematic, given the socio-cultural economic situation in India, is that in class 9, students will now be allowed to take up any combination of subjects of their choice, which is a very, very ideal scenario in the real world. If you think about it, if I would like to study biology, history, physics, and music, I should be able to do this. I think the major issue in the schools, because not every school will be equipped with the entire spectrum of subjects that children would like to take up. So some schools which have a lot of facilities, and some students will have a lot of provisions, while most students will lose out. Secondly, which I think is a major problem, is that not all teachers would have gone through the education system that we have today to be equipped to handle this. So they are talking about extensive teacher training. The time in which the NEP is going to be implemented might not be enough to change the mindsets of teachers. Third problem I see is, I think, a major issue. Even today, we have thousands of students across the country who are forced into, engineering and medicine because their parents think that this is what they should be doing. This happens after the children are in class 2 and they go to college. Now, imagine if we are saying that at age 14 or 15, you are going to do what you would like to do for life, and you are saying that students will have their own choice. How many of them will actually be able to choose and not be thrust into things that their parents think they should be doing? If this is going to happen, then of course we all know the consequences. We have quota, we have a series of students who commit suicide every year because of parental pressure, because of peer pressure, because they don't like what they're doing. They're under a lot of stress, and this, my worry is going to increase if this system is going to be allowed that students will be choosing subjects which will then lead them into streets. I was having a discussion with someone, and I was told, oh, it doesn't matter. We can come back to the system anytime. So I choose something, I don't like it. In my undergrad years, I can go and do something else. Now, being students of science, let us think about it a bit. If you have not been trained in the basics of science subjects when you are at that level of classes 9 to 12, you have chosen something different, and then 4 years later, you think that science is what I really want to do, it is my passion for life. Would you really have the option of getting back at the level that you want to shift? You can't, unless you have the option of going back to school. Now, what my worry is that the system very nicely gives all of this flexibility. It does not give people the flexibility of age. It still says children of ages this to this will go to this level. There are systems in which students have the flexibility of choice. They can choose to do whatever. They are assessed at different major stages in life. But then if they don't get above a certain required marks, then they have to go back a level and get better prepared and come back. In our system, we attach so much importance to failing and passing and grades and numbers and ranks that it is going to be a huge stigma for the child. If the child is told, no, you are not yet equipped to do the subject, please go back 3 levels and come back. This is not going to be an effective mechanism unless we change the mindset of the society. So my problem with this is, and only if I'm looking at the educational level in the schools, there are many other issues. But since you asked me about school education, this is going to be a major issue. And I don't think as a nation we are prepared. I was proposing to a lot of people during the pandemic, we should have a 0 year. And the first problem that first argument was, oh, people will fail for 1 year, they have to repeat a class. This is a major stigma. What about government jobs? Jobs have, age bars. So there's a huge problem even by saying, halt the academic year when there's a pandemic, let's restart tomorrow. That people are not ready to do. How can the society accept a policy which is going to do something which is quite path-breaking? Second main issue I have is the languages issue. It's of course excellent that we are promoting languages. We are saying children should learn in their mother tongue. Children should be bilingual. As a biologist, I know that very early in life, we have something called a language window in the brain, and children are capable of picking up many, many languages at the same time until a certain age. Problem I have is now, whether we like it or not, the major official language of communication globally is English. The major language of communication for academics is English. And now if we are going to say, let the children learn, let the medium of instruction be the mother tongue until they are a certain age, and then suddenly shift to English. I have come from a generation when I had friends who came to college having learned in Bangla, and I saw them struggle all through the college to take in a medium of instruction which was new to them. Of course, if we start early on, it's going to be slightly different, but I'm not very convinced that this is a good idea. We should be teaching languages, we should be putting emphasis on reading, writing, creative thinking, but not at the cost of helping our children to communicate globally when they grow up efficiently. So this is, I think, very important, that when I write in a certain language, I should be equipped to be able to think in that language and write as I'm writing, not think in my mother tongue and translate and then write in a different language, which is what happens if you are taught, the medium of instruction is one language until a certain age, and then you have to shift to another. You always think in the language you've been taught in, and then you translate in your mind and you speak and you write, which is not as efficient as if you can think in Bangla when you're speaking in Bangla, think in English when you're speaking in English. So this is a major issue I have, and also the major issue that we are a nation where people move across states. So when I say mother tongue, if I have a friend here who's a Telugu or a Tamil person, is their mother tongue going to be included in the school curriculum if they are living in Bengal? If not, what right do I have to force my mother tongue on a child who happens to be here from a different state? So that is my take on this school level curriculum. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for raising those very important issues. So I think, from what I understand, there are some goods to the policy, but there are major concerns about the implementation of it. Now, coming to the goods of this policy, I'll come to Ayush sir with a question on how they are portraying this policy with a lot of buzzwords around it, with like multidisciplinary education, value-based education, and then there's that multidisciplinary education, and there was something I'm missing out right now. So
continuous assessment.
Yes, there's continuous assessment as well. So
Holistic.
holistic education, yeah, holistic education is something that I have tried to make sense of. So
Okay, so
I think you will agree that with this government in place, it has become exceedingly important that we read between the lines. So I'll ask you, so what is your take on holistic education per se?
yeah, so for me, and first of all, I think Shushnata, this is an excellent thing that you're doing. I think this whole policy is not, and now whether this is being done purposely or by design or by accident or whatever, I don't know, but this policy is not certainly getting the discussion space and the argument space and the deliberation space that it deserves. I do not see much happening on the media. I do not see, especially a visual media, which has maximum impact on our lives these days. I do not really see people shouting and banging their heads and threatening to kill each other in the way that they do about whether Sushant Rajput had whatever had been murdered or killed, or whether that girlfriend of his should be jailed, whatever. I do not see the similar amount of excitement or even passion. Passion is complete lack of about this national education policy, and that is very unfortunate, because this is what is going to build the future nation called India. If, of course, India remains in the way that we know it when we grew up and the way it is even now. I have serious doubts about that. Anyway, so that's probably a different discussion. But for me, education, there is one thing which should be the guideline, which should be the lodestar behind education, and that is imparting or empowering an individual the ability to think for themselves. If my education does not allow me the ability to think decisively, to analyze stuff, not be spoon fed, not see stuff on Facebook. We have all these things called this advertising, which happens, targeted advertising and all that, right? Where there's this major thing about social media completely dictating the way we think and the way we rationalize and the way we sort of understand the world or whatever. So that only can happen because somehow we are not equipped to think, we do not want to think. And that is basically because our education does not allow us the flexibility nor the training to use our own minds to think. So, is the NEP addressing that? That is my main question, my main query. Holistic, multidisciplinary, these are all buzzwords, but these are ultimately utterly vacuous unless they impart the individual the ability to think and analyze on their own. Okay, so holistic, see, finally, if you really come to the core of it all, I mean, things are all connected. I mean, finally, if you are creative, I do not think that creativity in arts and creativity in science are all that different. So obviously, saying that I will only study physics and I will not look at chemistry and I will think that biology is only for idiots, that is gone. That is gone long back. And of course it is unfortunate that we may tend to think these days on that in India, but I think in at least in our research that has certainly disappeared. I mean, everybody knows now that sticking to one thing doesn't really help so much. You have to know what is happening in the world. The most successful papers come out of collaborations. I think that is absolutely quantified now. If you look at the number of papers that appear in the high-end journals like Nature and Science, most of them, I think 80% of them come from collaborations. I may be wrong on the number, but the trend is clear, right? So collaborations are the buzzword. That is really what matters. Holistic, multidisciplinary. If all of these do not impart to you the ability to think, they are completely meaningless. So Anandata actually said much of the stuff that I was planning to say. So to add to that, yeah, things like, I really do not understand how on earth a person in, like, my son is about 14, okay, and his world is still full of Harry Potter and all the super star factory that we have these days to completely control the imagination of children. He doesn't think about that. So if I ask him now to decide whether he wants to take up physics and music in class 9, he will take it up as whether he's being asked to wear a blue jeans or a black jeans the next day. Asking him that question is ridiculous, right? I think what is crucial is somehow giving a feeling to kids that everything is connected.
Right.
You do not know the history of your land. You do not know what or why the science that is being done in this world at this point of time, why that is being done. You will never realize that even science is politicized. Everything has a certain rationality. You have to realize that history is something which talks about how human beings have evolved on this planet. This NEP says that if you are uninterested in history, forget about it, throw it to the dustbin. That is ridiculous. If you do not know the origins of the society that you are now being, you're a part of, that will never allow you to appreciate what is happening in this world around you. History, there is this very cliched sentence called, history repeats itself. We don't even think deeply into it, but we do not realize how it's a tautology. It is so completely true. Whatever you are seeing now has happened in some form many a time in the recorded history of civilized humanity. Many a time. You see what America is doing in the Middle East. You look at what Britain did at Afghanistan 170 years back. Exactly the same. You look at what happened in Germany, Italy, you'll get a lot of clues of what might happen in many other places in the world at this point of time. Things have repeated, and now you say that you choose to be holistic, and yet you say that the basic ingredients that are needed to make an individual a thinking one, those can be thrown to the dustbin? I don't believe that. I don't buy that at all. It is good, of course, that this policy, as Ananda said, that you have the flexibility to study very diverse forms of subjects together. But are we prepared to do that? Do our schools have a curricula? I mean, have the possibility of offering commerce and carpentry? I mean, as we see many, in many of the actions of the present dispensation, there seems to be a very large gap between the motivation and the capability of implementation. Are we capable? For example, digital India was a big jargon, big buzzword. When 20 whatever percent of the country, I think 20% live below the poverty line till now. What is this thought of digital India? Right? I mean, that probably 30% of our people actually, or not 30% is an exaggeration, maybe 10% of our people really know the meaning of operating softwares. And we think of credit cards. You live in, Jaguli or Mohanpur, you live there. Can you go to a fish stall and, buy things on a credit card? Any shop in Mohanpur, will they use a credit card to give you anything? They won't, right? And yet that is the whole rationale for creating digital India. So same for this policy, right? You create a lot of buzzwords, and yet the main target of creating thinking individuals, does this policy address that? Multidisciplinary, but only after you have a solid base. That base cannot be compromised with. You basically think of education as building a pyramid, the pinnacle of which can never be reached in your whole life. But as you go on in your career, the pyramid approaches the pinnacle. Unless the base is solid, it will collapse just a little bit away from the base. The more solid the base, the more bigger the pyramid. If you're compromising on the base by bringing in buzzwords of different kind of subjects, which do not finally allow you to become a thinking, rational individual, I'm sorry to say, it is going to be finally all about a lot of words, but no meaning. It's going to be finally, empty vessels sound the most. So holistic, multidisciplinary are important, provided and only provided you have a very strong base. I feel that is being compromised somewhat, and I don't see too much of thought behind the preparedness of our schools, of our colleges, of our almost all our education providing institutions, and nor do I see a real an effort towards providing the space, the creative inputs that are needed to create thinking individuals. That is my take.
Right. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your opinions. So I think we all agree that the policy should aim to inculcate critical thinking and the ability to question among individuals. And I think that process starts from a very early age. And we did speak about school education in some extent. Now I'd like to move on to higher education. And for that, I'd like to call on my cousin brother, Dr. Siddhartha Karmakar, who has recently finished his PhD from IIT Indore. I'll ask him to speak on what he thinks about what has been said in this policy about graduate education and postgraduate education.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
And can you see my slides?
Not yet. Yes.
Yeah. So thanks for inviting me in this open meeting. And my previous speakers have really pointed out some very important points. I'm going to just focus on a few issues that I am worried about. So there's many discussion about the positives of this policy in the media, but I'll cut straight to the negative points that I think they're being. So it says in the draft that they're going to. So So Susnata, can you mute yourself because I'm getting a feedback? So this policy essentially says that you must recruit the very best and brightest minds to enter the teaching profession. So, but we need that. This is going to need a massive financial aid in terms of both infrastructure and research funding afterwards. But as we know that in the last few years, the government allocation on this higher education have been steadily falling. So it also says that uh, the, the policy says that we should set up at least one or one higher education institution in each district or near each district. So, so in an optimistic scenario, we are talking about 740 of such institutions. So we are going to need a lot of teaching power in these institutes. But now, before I make my next point, let me show this nice plot. So what it shows is that this government launched this Skill India mission, which enrolled around 6 million candidates. And if you look at the number of the enrollments and the employments after the skills were taught, there is a huge gap. There's like 1/4 of people who are enrolled for jobs. So essentially, we need to create more jobs, and maybe we need more quality teachers. So this is just an example of that fact that we need more quality teachers at these stages. So, but who knows what is going at the jobs frontier? So I'm going to just focus at the teachers' perspective here. If we look at the number of vacant posts across the various institutes in our country, there's around 30 to 40% of posts which are unfilled in all these kind of universities, IITs, NITs, etc. So these posts need to be filled immediately before we think about any more grand plans. Now, if we look at the number of, so here I'm just trying to show that if you look at the number of temporary teachers in these universities and colleges, it's just a little bit lower than the number of full professors or the equivalent positions. So my view is that as it is claimed in the policy, if you try to hike up the number of these institutes by a large number, you also need a large number of teachers, and these institutes will hike up these numbers with temporary lecturers because, of course, they won't have funds from the government because it is steadily dropping. And who knows what the private sectors will offer. And if the government-aided institutes hire the temporary lecturer jobs, they pay maybe 1/4 or 1/5 of the total the full assistant professor's salary. Then this is going to lead to a very unpleasant situation, which I think that in schools regarding the para teacher situation, they were told that they are going to get their jobs. They will have a stable situation in 10 years or so, but it's a complete fiasco. So I think that if you try to implement this policy very quickly, then you are going to see such a similar situation in the universities as well. Now, I'll show another interesting thing that I found recently. That so here in this picture on the right, you have this how much amount of GDP one country spends on the higher educations, and on the y-axis you have the numbers of researchers in per million. So India is at very close to the x-axis, which means is that the numbers of researchers in India is very less compared to the big giants. So though this policy looks very fancy, and of course you can argue that we are going to follow some of the Western models or something like that. But it really says that this huge gap in the researchers also reflect on the quality teachers, because the Indian government is now cutting out funds in research and developments. So whenever you are saying that you are going to implement a 4-year graduation program, where on the 4th year you are going to keep the option of research, so that it's really a worrying thing, because where are you going to the lecturers or the faculties who can carry out such a thing at colleges? If you keep dropping the funds for the PhDs and something like that. So, and even after that, if somebody comes from a 4-year undergraduate program, then you offer him a 1-year master's, then it is going to lead to a very bad situation in the PhD, I guess. So I just end my talk here, but I'll point out a few things. That is, first of all, the government allocated funds are not going to be enough, and clearly in the policy as well, the government is seeking private help. So both PG and UG educations are going to be much more costly, and the kind of scenario which we see in United States, maybe we are looking at a very bad student loan situation in 10-20 years or something. Uh, Now, of course, the policy stresses on the short-term vocational training, which apparently sound like a good idea, but of course, the government is relieving itself of the responsibility of any serious job security, or the responsibility of creating long-term jobs. In the meantime, the people who are going to profit from all this are the internet service providers and mobile companies and the new edtech industry. And another issue was raised by one of my previous speakers, that the science students, they can't possibly learn in the Indian or local languages if they want to stay in academia, or if they want to move around the country while they're students. And for me, the main concern still remains about the appointment of new lecturers in colleges or universities, or the so-called higher education institutions. So yes.
Thank you, Siddhartha. Those they were actually very pertaining points that were raised here, and the implementation of the policy does seem very dubious to me. I'll follow up on the point that you raised about the privatization of education, where the government is trying to seek external fundings to kind of help it out. And to follow it up, I'll call on a friend of mine, Shona Kundu, who's a banker by profession. So I'll ask him, so what do you think about this privatization of education? And if you go to the NEP document, you will see the word private/philanthropy efforts in education mentioned at least like 10 times. What do you make out of that?
Yeah, first of all, hello everyone. I hope you can all hear me.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. So the first thing that I would like to say that when I was basically hearing everyone else, I latched onto a point by Anindita ma'am, where she told how many students have the ability to choose. I would just like to add to that point that not only the ability to choose, but what are the choices that we are getting. What I mean by that is basically with NEP or with right to education, the idea was that every student or every child will have more or less an equal opportunity to study. But what privatization does to our education system, it basically puts a caveat on it. What is the caveat? That obviously you have the right to study, but there are subscriptions. Let's say, example like a mobile company. If you have a good subscription plan, you will get all the benefits. If you have a low subscription plan, you will get almost no benefits. So the education policy with privatization basically almost runs like that. The second thing that we basically that was mentioned was private philanthropy. So what in essence the government is trying to say Although basically what it, even in an article it has written that it doesn't really want the for-profit organizations to run privates, it wants private philanthropy. So private organizers will run like a public institution, which is a little hard to believe. So anyway, I would just like to show a few slides where I have detailed what private philanthropy and what are the issues with privatization that I see that you might not see it at first, but these are issues that develop over a time. I'll just like to share the screen a minute.
Yes. Is there a problem, sir? Not.
Just a moment. I'm sharing. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, good. So basically, first I'll define what private philanthropy is in India. What we basically say are private philanthropists. So first is basically the CSR, as you all know. Then what we can say is family-run organizations. For example, if you have heard of Muthupa Group in South, that is a family-run organization. Next is public trusts and NGO or donations. So these are what we call private philanthropy in India. If you see from the year, if you see right side of the screen, from the year 1317, because I got only data for that, uh, Indian philanthropic funding is around $700 million in education only and in vocational training. And the foreign philanthropic funding is around $200 million. Out of that $700 million, around $600 million is from CSR activities. Although the problem
CSR stands for.
is basically corporate social responsibility.
Right.
Yeah. Now, the issue with the 600 million is that obviously the companies get tax benefits out of it. So you can say that it is almost like coercing the private firms to almost have an interest. So it is not really philanthropic, although we are as in constituting as private philanthropic, it is not really philanthropic. Now, there are some issues with our how we define basically private philanthropy. One is that no reporting standards for Indian Philanthropic Foundation. So there is no standard reporting formats. So what happens when you don't have standard reporting formats, you don't have data, you cannot analyze that which sectors actually need the investments, where the investments are going, is it helpful or not, is it doing any proper impact, is it having any proper impact, we don't know. So the second is CSR is regulated by MCA, that is basically the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, which is great. But the other non-profits are not regulated by MCA. They are regulated by different regulation acts of states, and so if the states have one, sometimes the states don't even have regulation acts. The other thing is with philanthropic allocation is that out of the 100% philanthropic allocation, Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh have almost around 60% of the philanthropic allocation. Now you will say, okay, is there anything special in these three states? Probably not. But the thing is that most of the corporates are quite assembled, you can say, in these three states. Delhi is one more example, but Delhi has a very good public schooling system compared to these three. And I'm only talking about schooling. I'm not even talking about the higher secondaries, or I'm not even talking about higher education. So this is something to be noticed. There was one more point that it was noticed that private philanthropy invests in states where the public funding is more. So for example, in Maharashtra, the public funding is more for education and also for private philanthropy. So that means the states which do not have any access to any funds are still not getting any funds. the rich are becoming richer. That is basically almost that is the point. Now I will just talk about a few. I'll just move on to the next slide. So I'll just talk about the ways privatization affects the education system. Now these these are not in general positive or negative points as per se, but the, it is very important how we implement them. So the first is standardized tests. I hope everybody can see this.
Yes, yes, we can.
Uh, what happens in standardized tests is basically a, for example, class, let's say from class 5 to 9. The 10th is a board exam, the 12th is a board exam, well and good, that's okay. From class 6 to or 5 to 9, sometimes what happens with privatization is a body comes in, for example, there in it hasn't happened in India as of now, but in other countries, what happens is private companies come which run standardized tests. Standardized tests from, for example, these tests are for moving on to the next class. Basically, standardized tests means that. Now, these companies also publish books which you have to study. So it kind of creates a monopoly. You are studying that book to pass that test. You're not really getting anything else. Because you're subscribed to that standardized test, you are having to go in a particular direction. It's a monopoly. Second is educational management organizations or EMOs. Now these are very special. So what happens is, let's say that a private organization has got a public funding. Let's say I'm counting the public funding as 100%. Let's say 100% is my total public funding. Now what happens is the private organization says, or the institute says to an educational management organization that I'll take 10%, you have the rest of the 90%, and you run the school because you have expertise in running the school. Now these EMOs run the school at, let's say, that 90% funding capacity. There is no proper monitoring of how these schools are run, and an EMO can run. There is no limit to the number of schools it can run. So for example, an EMO can run over 30, 50 schools, or how many, even 100. These are educational management organizations. So there is no limit to them running the school. So let's say if there are 10 schools, so it basically runs that entire system. Now it doesn't have, so irrespective of the performance. Now why I say that irrespective of the performance, I'll come to the next point, that is funding, regulating and monitoring. Why I say that? So this is an example that I've taken from United States because private in United States, like probably we are going that way. The closest because we don't have data of our own. So maybe that is why I had to kind of extrapolate the system and the data from United States. So what happens is, when monitoring the system of a government school, it has to receive funding, right? So the funding can be in 1 or 2 or 3 ways. Even in the NEP document, you will see that the government has said that it will have various ways of funding a school, but it has not mentioned what are the ways. There is no exact way. So what happens? So what are these ways? So some of these ways are basically the number of present students in a school. It can be the performance of a school year on year. These are the kind of things that, or the capacity of a school, or how many students have enrolled. These are the kind of things that government helps when it says that it will fund the school. For example, there are 500 students. Government says that for each student who has, let's say, over 80% attendance, I am going to pay you 10,000 rupees. Now, the school can easily mark attendance, and even for online schools or online courses, if you can easily mark attendance. Now, who is going to verify this? It is impossible for the state or the central government to go to a school every day to check if it is maintaining all the rules or not. Now, what it does, it helps in getting these numbers through NGOs, which monitor the school system. The problem with these NGOs is, as it was found in United States, was many of these NGOs are owned by the same owner of the EMOs. So are you getting the point? So it is already in hoops. It's already in loops basically. So no advantage. So it is not proper monitoring of the system. The next point that I would just like to make is endowment funds for higher education. Now, endowment fund was a concept that was uh, foreign to us, but I think IIT Delhi has already started it, uh, and many other institutes have already started it in India for higher education. This is specifically for higher education. So, endowment funds basically, these are charitable funds in higher education institutes which can be invested in market, like for IPOs or debt market, equity market, and you can have the profits, and the profit will be utilized for specific causes in a school system or in a higher education system. The problem with the endowment is, in essence, it's a very good idea that you are keeping funds, and these funds are coming from your alumni, and you are keeping these funds to basically save it for a rainy day, or if the college or if the school is in trouble, or there are special uh, accommodations that needed to be done or infrastructure needed to be built, that you are building this endowment fund. Now, what is the proper size of the endowment fund? IIT Delhi has told that it wants an endowment fund of $1 billion in the next 7 years. Just to give you a comparison, Harvard has an endowment fund. This year it was 41 billion USD. Now, when that idea of endowment fund was floated, it was said that maybe we can have, there is a profit balance, there is a basically school balance sheet or the higher education balance sheet. Maybe we can have an endowment fund 3 to 4 times greater than what the year's balance sheet is, just so that we can have a little bit of leeway. But when you see these huge amount of endowment funds, you have to question that what's the point if the fees of the educational institutes are increasing and they have this much amount of funds in their system. What is the point of increasing the educational fees? The next point is these endowment funds become special interest groups. So anybody can invest in it. It is not only the alumni. The idea was alumni, but anybody. So if Reliance, let's say, I'm just giving an example with Reliance. So if Reliance invests in any of, let's say, IIT Delhi's funds, then it becomes a stakeholder in that. So it can obviously have decisions. What are the decisions? Who are we giving scholarships to? Are we giving scholarships? If we are giving, what is the money that we are giving or offering in scholarships? What is the fees that we are going to charge? So these then become out of the hands of the educational institute. These then get out of the hand of the educational institute. The fifth point is student debt. Now, what happens? What we have seen in US is the student debt has basically boomed. There is still no proper data of student debt in India. So I'll just give you an idea of what the student debt, basically privatization and increasing student loans have done to the US. So in US, the student debt is $1.64 trillion.
Shona, for the interest of time, I'll request you to keep it a brief.
Yeah, speed up the process. Yeah. So $1.64 million is just 2 points only. Yeah, $1.64 million, which is shared among 45 million subscribers. Just to give you what this is, the credit card bill of US or the credit card debt is 1.1 trillion. So the student debt has even surpassed that. The sixth point is basically the employees, the teachers. Now, what happens is when you're in a private school, sometimes the labor laws will get violated. In what sense? For example, let's say that a school or in the labor law, it says that if you do 40 hours in a week, you are privy to PF, gratuity, and insurance. Now, what these private schools sometimes do it, they'll give you 36 hours a week, and you won't have these three benefits. You will have the same salary maybe, but you won't have the guaranteed benefits like an insurance or a PF. The last is basically research motivated by special interest groups. What I mean by that is, for example, if ITC does a research that cigarette is not really actually harmful to your system, like Philip Morris did in US back in the 80s, or any other special interest group is driving research which is it really wants in its space, then it really becomes difficult for even for research institutes to stay, especially because of the funding, to stay unbiased. So that is one of the things. I would just like to compare some of the world data. This is OECD data. This is something. Yeah, can you everyone see the slide? So OECD is basically reading score, math score, science score. Now, yeah, can everybody see the slide?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Yeah. So for example, on the left side, I'll give you examples of the top 10 countries as far as the OECD ratings are concerned. India doesn't feature because India doesn't give the ratings. Now you will see, obviously you can see all the countries like China, Hong Kong, Finland, whatever. But if you see the private funding, you will see the actual percentages, the rightmost column. The highest you will see is Taiwan, 40%. But even most of Taiwan's funding comes from China, which is then again state-backed. So make what you feel, make profit. But the highest then is probably, I think, New Zealand, which comes at 16%, is the private funding. And even in many of these countries, it is still subsidized. For example, teachers are paid. Even for private schools, teachers are paid in Japan by the public, by the basically tax system. Now I'll give you a comparison of countries which are similar. So Finland and Sweden are countries which are similar and nearby to each other, and Canada and US. Now Canada and Finland have public systems, more or less public systems, and Sweden and US have private systems. Now you will see the ranking of the OECD metrics based on the kind of funding. Lastly, I would just like to say, in the beginning, I had mentioned that for telephone companies, there are subscriptions. For example, now Jio is winning, and I am a subscriber of Airtel and a BSNL. So basically, I am in the losing parties. But my question is basically, in essence, the business venture thrives on competition and also fails on competition. It's a zero-sum game. But can we ask that same question for our education? So if my education system is Airtel and BSNL, should I just give up? That is my question. Yeah, I'd just like to end it here. Thank you.
Thank you for making that very important point here. We'll quickly move on. Now we'd like to share our thoughts with Professor Indrajit Das. He's a retired professor and an eminent teacher and educationist. He has a vast experience of teaching from level of school to university. And I think it's worth mentioning here that he's associated with a lot of social, cultural, and literary activities. He had volunteered to teach students at the Alipur prison in the correctional homes when there was no one else to volunteer for that job. He has to his credit a collection of English poetry and a book on collection of Bengali poetry. Professor Das believes in the freedom of thought, and his ideas on education and the upliftment of society always has a modernist approach. I'll ask him to comment on what he thinks of the national education policy, and I have one question for him in specific, which is that the policy says in brief, in one single sentence, that the MPhil course is being discontinued. I would like you to comment on what you think of this, the MPhil course being discontinued, and was it any good to begin with? Please.
Thank you, Sushnata, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this seminar. The National Education Policy 2020 has come out, and it has caused a mixed reaction among the educationists, teachers, and the guardians and others. The first national policy came out in 1968 and followed by two others with certain changes and amendments in 1986 and 1992. And then this particular policy, national policy of 2020, this is a very ambitious project of the central government, because they think that it envisages the change in the life of millions of students. it has cast a shadow of doubt and fear in the minds of others. Policies have been made, policies have been changed and also discarded later on. The most important changes in the higher education is the conversion of the 3-year degree course to 4-year degree course, the multiple entry and exit system, as well as the MPhil abolition of the MPhil course, discontinuation of the MPhil course. My point in this connection is this, that I don't think that this has been a good decision to discontinue the MPhil course. For you see that if we just go into the details of the division of the course, there are 4 parts. I mean the 4-year degree course. When the student completes the first-year degree course, he gets a certificate. Then after the completion of the second, that is the advanced diploma certificate is awarded. And after the third, it is a graduation degree course certificate. And after that, he may join the post-graduation course class, or then he may continue in the 4th year class, which will award him the graduation degree for research work. Now, after the 4th year, that means here in between degree course and post-graduation course, the MPhil course is missing. It has got no place. But from my experience, I've seen that it really helped the students as well as the teachers of colleges to have a test of research work during their service or during their student life. They got it, but now they have discontinued it. I don't know what the reason is there, and I don't find anything that will be good for anybody. Now, instead of, I think, because there are students who cannot really take up the advantage of, or rather continue with the research work, which is a strenuous and also requires a long time effort. That is why they may not continue. But when they start with an MPhil course, that he has the chance of writing a thesis, a dissertation. But I remember that in the past, I don't know whether it is still there or not, in the MSc course, a dissertation, in the particular in the science section, dissertation had to be written by the students. That is something like that, the paper that a student has to write in the MPhil course. So I think that discontinuing this are not beneficial for the students, because in the 4th year class, the student do not have that mind to jump into the research work. I don't think so. But if they have the chance of attending the MPhil course, or they complete the MPhil course, they will have the very chance of presenting the knowledge of how to approach the research work. So in this case, I'd rather say that instead of removing the MPhil course, that it could be remodeled with a well-planned way, in a well-planned way, so that it can keep the students or maybe students may be interested to pursue their PhD. So I think that it should not be, it may be continued, but with a remodeled form. That definitely there have been much comments regarding this MPhil dissertations, but there have been good dissertations also. So I think that if this is continued, or this is rather placed in the course, it will be good for the students. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Das, for your time and for your opinions. Before I move on to call on Professor Soumitra Banerjee for a detailed lecture, I'll just briefly call on my friend Usha Das, who is a journalist by profession. In a time when in India journalism has become a joke, I still take pride to introduce her, because she's working for the Press Trust of India, and her job demands her to report on the proceedings of the Supreme Court of India. So, Usha, I'd like to ask you, on your perspective, and what do you think of the policy, not from an academician's perspective? What do you have to say on the policy? What are we missing out here?
Hi everyone. Can you hear me, Shushnato?
Yes, yes, I can.
Okay. So overall, on a mere and loose reading of this policy, I realized that it's really good on paper. It has touched every point that we need in our education system right now. But the thing is, there are certain points which I felt that it talked in details about certain points which we already know, like home language, like research funds, like gender sensitivity, like inclusion of transgenders and everything. But one of the main points that is missing from this policy is that the implementation part, like it has talked about gender sensitivity, it has talked about violence, harassment, uh, these kinds of things, and it has also talked about inclusion of transgenders, but it has not talked about it has talked about dropout rates also, and it has said that we need to decrease the dropout rates. But we all know the problems, main reasons why females drop out. It's menstruation, unintended pregnancies, child marriages. These are some of the main reasons. So I think it should have talked about specifically about inclusion of sex education in our system. That is missing. They have loosely talked about gender sensitivity, but they have not particularly talked about including sex education in our curriculum. So by including sex education, we'll make boys and girls aware of abuses, sexual abuses, menstruations, and student safety, female student safety in particular, and these child pregnancies, child marriages, and everything. So this is one thing that is missing out from this policy. And also, according to a recent UNICEF report, 27% females get married before age 18, and which is likely to be pushed to 20% due to COVID situations. So this is an alarming rate, and we should really focus on it. And it's high time that this education policy is of the year 2020, and it's high time that we talked about these things. So yeah, and one other thing, it also doesn't talk about religious minorities. We have recently seen the riots in the Northeast Delhi states, and the Muslim minorities specifically, they don't talk about religious minorities and the inclusion of and the importance of understanding religious minorities, the problems that they are facing and everything. So after these, there are several kinds of discriminations against various religious minorities, and specifically after these riots kind of situations, the dropout rates would increase. So, and also one other point, the last point, that is they talk about setting up of MIRUs, which is multidisciplinary education and research universities. My point is, if you want to include liberal arts and science and everything in under one institution, why set up different institutions now? Why not include it in the institutions and the universities that are already available in India? So the funds that you'll require to set up different separate universities, I think the funds you'll require to include all these in the already prevalent universities will be much less. So yeah, these are the points that I wanted to talk about.
Thank you, Usha. Those are really, really important points, and thank you for bringing those up. Now it's my deep privilege to welcome Professor Soumitra Banerjee to deliver his talk. Professor Soumitra Banerjee is the Faculty of Physical Sciences in IISER Kolkata. He is also the Dean of Academic Affairs here. He is a member of all the three major Indian Academy of Sciences, and it's my deep privilege to have him with us here. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Shushnato. Well, how much time do I have?
So I'll go with 30 minutes that we had initially decided on.
Okay. Okay. So I'll go into a presentation mode.
Yes, sir.
Can you see the presentation now?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay, great. It should go into the. It's not going into a full screen mode. What happened? Yeah. Well, today is the 200th birth anniversary of the legendary Renaissance personality, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. And today I do not have time to talk about his life and contribution, but we all know that he had a lot of contribution in the field of education. He was a visionary in the field of education. So what I'll talk about is what he wanted education system to be, and how over the years, over 70 odd years of independence, it has shaped up, and what the new education policy plans to do to those issues. Firstly, so Vidyasagar wanted education for all, but in reality, we have education only for a very small minority of the Indian population. And the government's own document, the draft education policy that was released in 2019, says that India currently has the largest non-literate population in the world. And the numbers are given. I'm not reading out all the points that I've quoted from either the draft education policy or the new education policy. You can, since it is being recorded, you can read these later. But it is a dismal situation that presently prevails, which is at odds with Vidyasagar's vision. Vidyasagar wanted schools to be modern-day temples. And yet, we see that most government-run schools are in a very bad condition. Most schools do not have proper buildings, do not have roof over their heads. Most schools don't have toilets, especially for girls. Even many classes are handled by a single teacher. As a result, the government's education policy itself, this education policy admits that the gross enrollment ratio for grades 6 to 8 was 90.9%, while for grades 9 to 10 and 11 to 12, it was only 79.3% and 56.5%. So it's clear that 50% of the students drop out while in school, and the largest dropout is in grade 8. I'll come to this issue a little later. And Vidyasagar started many vernacular medium schools, and he wanted the state-run, government-funded vernacular medium schools to be the mainstream of school education. But yet, what has happened is that the standard of education in the government-run schools has become very bad, deliberately has been made very bad, because when I was a kid, these schools were truly mainstream. Over the years, these have been made very bad through a few bad decisions. For example, there was a deliberate degradation of the examination system and the introduction of no detention policy up to class 8, as a result of which there was no check on what the students were learning, and suddenly at class 8 there was an exam and most students dropped off. And there was also abolition of English learning in the primary and lower secondary levels.
I think your slides are not changing. We are still on the first slide.
Oh, I'm changing. What happened? Goodness.
I think don't go to the full screen mode. That is messing it up, I think.
Is that so? Okay, right now can you see this slide?
Yeah, we can see. Yeah.
Okay. Then I'll not go to the full screen mode.
Okay.
Reading might be a bit difficult. Okay, so and Vidyasagar wanted education to reach the poorest, but what we see today is that students are divided into haves and have-nots. Two kinds of educations have been created: the government-run schools, where people get low-quality education, and private English medium schools have mushroomed, taking advantage of these situations, and there people get a high, relatively high quality education. So we see a haves and have not kind of situation in the country, which is definitely something that Vidyasagar didn't want. Vidyasagar wanted every Indian to know their mother language and English well. This is a very important point that he made. I'll not quote him, I don't have time for that, but he wrote various books in the mother tongue, and he made various efforts so that to ensure that students learn English right from school. But over the years, the language learning has degraded so much so that today students are unable to express their own thoughts in written or even oral form, in a cultivated form. So that's what is expected of a learned person, which is not happening today. And Vidyasagar wanted education to be scientific, while in reality we see unscientific education system all around. And I will not go into all these points, but you can easily see that even those who go through the education system harbor hundreds of unscientific ideas and superstitions. Why didn't these get eradicated through the process of education? Because our education system is unscientific. Here we do not teach students not to believe anything without evidence. Here we do not teach, we teach science, we teach the theories and theorems and lemmas and all these things of science, but we never tell them, don't believe anything without evidence. So this is an unscientific education system. Again, that's something that Vidyasagar didn't want. And Vidyasagar wanted higher education to percolate in the Indian community, Indians to be highly educated, but we see a poor enrollment in higher education. So gross enrollment ratio, according to this education policy, in higher education is only 26.3%, the figures of 2018. And the fact is that over the years, university education system has been gradually eroded through various means, through less funding, through political and other intervention of the internal working of the universities, and whatever means. But fact is that university education has been gradually eroded, and some relatively more favored institutions have been created. Ours is one of them, but the IITs and NITs and all. But most of the students study in normal universities, and all over the world you will find the universities are the place where research happens. The universities are the place where most of the people get educated, higher education happens. But it's in our country that's not quite so. In this situation, let us look at what the NEP tries to do or wants to do. The vision clearly said that the national education policy envisions an education system rooted in Indian ethos. Now that, I'll explain later, is a bit problematic thing. The whole thing runs that it is the Indian ethos, Indian heritage, Indian culture, Indian language. So all these things are basically nationalistic fervor that the education system intends to bring. Per se, I will not criticize that, but I will say that that is a bit problematic because education and science are by nature international. There are certain good things about NEP. I actually liked certain things that are said in the NEP, and whenever I discuss anything, be it about a man, be it about a personality, be it about an education policy, I first try to look for what is positive in that. And yes, there were certain things positive. For example, the new education policy intends students to not only learn, but more importantly, learn how to learn. That is something I found that is indeed laudable. And it says that education must build character, enable learners to be ethical, rational, compassionate, caring, while at the same time prepare them for gainful, fulfilling employment. So these are good things, I would say. The education policy at least spells out. It says that quality higher education must aim to develop good, thoughtful, well-rounded, creative individuals. It must enable an individual to study one or more specialized areas of interest at a deep level and also develop character, ethical and constitutional values, intellectual curiosity, scientific temper. I have colored it because this is something that we have been demanding for quite some time. At least it acknowledges that this is necessary. Creativity, spiritual service, and 21st century capabilities across a range of disciplines. So these are the things that I found good. So the principles, it lays out that the purpose of the education system is to develop good human beings capable of rational thought and action, possessing compassion and empathy, courage, resilience, scientific temper, and creative imagination and sound ethical moorings and values. These are really laudable pronouncements in the new education policy. But then let us see, when they actually come down to the nuts and bolts, what they will actually do. Does that reflect these visions of the policy? That is what we have to look at. Now, if you look at the school system, they talk about a complete restructuring of the school system. There has already been a discussion on the school system, so I'll not get into the details of it. But I have already pointed out that one of the reasons of the erosion of the government school system were two things. One was that there was no checks and balances as to what the students are learning. There was a automatic promotion up to class 8. This policy also talks about no detention policy, and there will be only exams in 3 stages: 3rd, 5th, and 8th. And what kind of knowledge will be imparted? Now comes the issue. They clearly specify, if you can read, you'll find these numbers are written. These are the clauses of the education policy. It says, knowledge of India, that means something that will be offered as a subject. Knowledge of India will include knowledge from ancient India and its contribution to modern India and successes and challenges, Indian knowledge system, including tribal knowledge, indigenous traditional ways of learning, and all that, astronomy, philosophy, all these things that were the traditional Indian knowledge system. And an engaging course of Indian knowledge system will also be available to students at the secondary level as an elective. Now, one earlier discussion in this particular, one of the earlier discussion that happened today pointed out that all these options being available to the students is all sounding nice. But supposing that many courses do not become available, only a few courses become available, effectively students will be forced to take these courses. And here's an indication what will become available: the Indian knowledge system. Now, over the years, we have been hearing about what the Indian knowledge systems are, or what their vision about the Indian knowledge systems are. Actually, there was a lot of development in mathematics, astronomy, medical science, and all that, but that is not really what they talk about. They talk about placing an elephant head on a human torso. They talk about flying aeroplanes 5,000 years back. They talk about there being television and internet in the time of Mahabharata and all that. This might, my fear is that this might be portrayed as the Indian knowledge system. And noticeable is the fact that there was a lot of discussion on the Indian knowledge system. Not even once in the Indian heritage is there a mention of the Indian freedom struggle. There is a lot of discussion regarding what is said to be the ashram shalas, something that will control much of the junior level education. Now, there is a fear that these ashram shalas will be essentially the organization led by religious fanatics, and there is definitely a problem there. The language policy, as I have already mentioned, Vidyasagar visualized a policy where the vernacular medium, that means in every state there's a mother tongue that will be cultivated, that will be seriously taught, and at the same time English will be taught. Now this education policy proposes a 3-language formula, and English will be introduced at a later stage. And there will be 2 other Indian languages, and it says that there will be a lot of emphasis on Sanskrit and on Hindi. At least the draft education policy lay emphasis only on Sanskrit and Hindi, but there was a lot of criticism. So now they say that Pali, Persian, Prakrit, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Malayalam, Odia will also be offered. Now, can you imagine a rural school in, say, Tamil Nadu offering Odia as a elective course? That will never happen. What will actually happen is that imposition of Hindi, imposition of Sanskrit. And Sanskrit will be essentially, if somebody learns the language Sanskrit for the purpose of reading those literature, I have no objection to that whatsoever. But if that becomes a medium for cultivation of some obscurantist ideas, I do have objection to that. In a multilingual country like ours, the right policy, I believe, is a 2-language formula, the mother tongue as well as English. Now, I would like to differ a bit from what Professor Anindita Bhadra said. My education was entirely through vernacular medium. I studied my whole schooling in Bengali medium, and I had no difficulty in catching up at the college level. The reason is that in our time, English was taught with a lot of emphasis right from class 1. But later, that became dropped. The emphasis on English became secondary. And finally, we have a situation where the students are really facing a lot of difficulty in catching up unless they study in English medium. This is a very bad thing. Our students are now not being able to write and read proper Bengali. That's not good. But I would say that if we have an education system where the vernacular medium is done in school, along with a very strong emphasis on English, then there is no difficulty in catching up. When I'm speaking English, I don't think you are feeling that I'm deficient in English, but I studied in Bengali medium. There's no difficulty with that. The points regarding Sanskrit is that I have a bit of misgiving regarding so much emphasis on Sanskrit is that there is a particular clause in this policy where they say that Sanskrit will be mainstreamed with strong offerings. There will be Sanskrit universities, and it will be connected to other contemporary and relevant subjects such as mathematics and astronomy. Now, there has been an attempt earlier to introduce a course called Vedic mathematics in schools and colleges, which many scientists pointed out is neither Vedic nor mathematics. Neither Vedic, because in the Vedic time there was no place value system, there was no zero. But these books talks about a modern number system, so definitely this cannot be Vedic. And they have also pointed out these are not mathematics either. These are only calculational techniques, which really doesn't help understand mathematics. And they have said that the Sanskrit will become a natural part of a holistic, multidisciplinary higher education. Now, there was some discussion regarding holistic and multidisciplinary. Now, do you see in which direction things are going? They're essentially trying to introduce the kind of obscurantist ideas into the education system in the name of holistic and multidisciplinary education. So there would be a 4-year integrated multidisciplinary BA dual degree program in education and Sanskrit. So that's what the education policy claims. Higher education aims at creating 3 tiers of education systems. One is the research-intensive universities. The more coveted universities are the type. And there are teaching universities where there will be no research, only teaching. And there will be autonomous degree-granting colleges. You notice there was earlier a discussion regarding the 4-year BSc system in which there is supposed to be research in the 4th year. Now, if the university is basically a teaching university, designated as a teaching university, no research component, no funding for research, then how are we going to have a research component in the BSc level? It's a misnomer. And moreover, if every college becomes autonomous degree granting colleges, every nook and corner, small colleges, presently students study in those colleges, but ultimately appear in exams conducted by the university, so that they get a degree by the university. These degrees have some weight. Now, if every street corner college is a degree awarding institution, then those degrees will have no value. A bigger challenge is that all these autonomous colleges will fight among themselves to give more and more marks to the students. Even with 99% marks, nobody will get a admission anywhere else. That is a reality. This year, this has happened. With 96% marks, students did not get admission in most colleges. Why? Because this time the marks were so high. So the undergraduate program, we have a situation where they're talking about a very, what should I say, flexible system, according to them, where one can even earn credits from different institutions, even through the MOOCs and other courses. So one does not really have to go to a college or a university, and through that they will one can earn a degree. The open distance learning is now, according to this policy, going to become a mainstream. And I'll show you, it actually says that they want to increase the gross enrollment ratio using online education. Now, this is a very dangerous trend, I feel. This time we are having to do online education. I'm very, very uncomfortable with it. And now if that becomes a mainstream of education, then we have real difficulty. I'll just point out that in order to study physics, one has to study mathematics too. In order to study biology, one has to learn a bit of chemistry. In order to learn economics, one has to learn a bit of statistics, one has to learn a bit of sociology and things like that. So there are allied subjects. So a subject stand alone, and then you get completely disarrayed collection of subjects will make you good for nothing. That is the problem. And that judgment we cannot expect students to exercise. Therefore, some flexibility is good, but absolute flexibility about choosing anything will not do good for the students. And as I said, online education is here to stay. This education policy clearly says that much of the education will now be online, and open distance learning will be a major avenue by which they plan to increase the gross enrollment ratio. The governance of education, now a new entity is being created, Higher Education Commission of India, HECI. It will again have a few tiers called National Higher Education Regulatory Council, National Accreditation Council, National Higher Education Grants Council, General Education Council, and all that. Most important point is that education is something in a concurrent list. It is not a centralized education system. Much of it is controlled by the states. Now, these are centralized bodies, mostly governed by bureaucrats. So effectively, we are moving away from a educationist-centric. It was not very educationist-centric so far, but still there were some educationists who found place in the education controlling bodies. But now it is more or less going to become administrative bodies administered by administrators. This is a onslaught on, though there is a lot of talk about autonomy, this is going to result in a lot of onslaught on autonomy. And this has been discussed, so I don't want to discuss in detail, but there is a very clear indication of there being an all-out commercialization. They don't say that, but indication is that, because they clearly say that all higher education institutions, private and public, shall be treated at par within this regulatory regime, and the regulatory regime shall encourage private philanthropic efforts in education. Now, there has been some discussion as to what these private philanthropic efforts could be, but right now, 90% of the private philanthropic efforts are religious organizations. And now a majority of these are becoming, what should I say, culturally problematic. And therefore, we need to move away from this religious run organization whose purpose is indoctrination of the young souls into a proper scientific government run education system. This particular policy is actually moving away from that. And these higher education institutions will be allowed to set fees for their programs independently without any control. As somebody just pointed out, this will become another corporate funding avenue. Say tomorrow Reliance can invest a share, buy a share in a college or university. So it's going to become something like that. I'm close to close. Now here, there is some discussion regarding financing of education in this policy. And they clearly admit that despite this critical importance of research, the research and innovation investment in India is at a current time only 0.69% of GDP as compared to 2.8% in the United States of America, 4.3% in Israel, and 4.2% in South Korea. And we scientists have been demanding an increase in the outlay of research for a long time. All the marches for science have been demanding that. And then what solution is it proposing? It is proposing that it is creating a single funding agency, National Research Fund. So far, we had many funding agencies. We had the CSIR, we had the DST and DST's subsidiary SERB, we had the DBT, we had the DIT, and all that. These were science funding organizations. Now a single entity is created. This policy does not say that the others will be abolished, but effectively, if you siphon off their funds into this fund, then obviously they will become ineffective a few years down the line, and only one organization will survive. The problem is that if I submit a proposal in some funding agency and it doesn't get supported due to whatever reasons, I have the option of submitting to another funding agency. If there's one funding agency, that option goes. And through one funding agency, the state can dictate what will be the funding priorities. The blue sky research that we do, curiosity-based research, will become secondary. That's my apprehension. And the financing of education, now they clearly say that the public expenditure on education has not come close to the recommended level of 6%. And all these policies that have happened, 6% was recommended in 1968. And since then, there have been many education policies, all the governments, and I suppose Siddhartha has shown a graph which showed that it is actually quite low. They admit that. And then they say that we will increase it to 6% of the GDP. That's good, wonderful. But the caveat is that the GDP includes the governmental as well as private investment in education. So a private entrepreneur taking in education just as another investment opportunity from which profit is to be reaped, that will also be counted as investment in education. And that way, if it reaches 6%, it is not going to do any good for our education system. What we really need is funding the universities, funding the government schools, making proper government schools. That is going to be going to take a secondary position. Really, I don't need to talk about this. This government has reduced the funding of education year after year. And Siddhartha has shown that 2014 onwards, there has been a continuous downward trend. Now, if somebody says, now, right now, we are from ICERs, and the ICER regularly get the signal from the earlier it was the MHRD, now it becomes Minister of Education, that the education, the support that it gets from the government will be less, and it has to support itself more and more from the students' fees. And the student fees, how much we take is not in our hands. It is dictated by the government. Now, because of that, a year back, the IIT's fees went from 90,000 per semester to 2 lakh per semester, because they were forced to increase it, because they had to, they said that you have to raise your funds from that and not from the government. So if this is the situation, do we believe that the government is really going to increase the education outlay? What will effectively happen is that private organizations will invest more and more, avenues will be opened, and then it will show that, see, now the total investment is 6% of the GDP. Now this, I think, is dangerous. To just conclude, I would say that the visions of Vidyasagar have not been given any importance by the succession of governments who have ruled the country since independence. I'm not sparing any government for that matter. And this government, the policy that it is formulated, does no justice to that vision of a scientific, secular, democratic education system. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for so lucidly laying it out in front of us. And I believe now we see the red flags that we had initially missed out, maybe. I would now open the floor for questions and a free discussion. If anyone has any questions, please ask. Okay, someone has given a question. I'll read it out to you.
Yeah.
So, sir, Siddhartha is asking, sir, do you think it is possible to generate the large pool of postgraduates required to teach within the new undergraduate structures? After all, the funds are dropping in R&D. Even if the funds are stagnant, inflation renders those insufficient.
Yes. So since there is inflation, the educational outlay has to increase every year. If it is kept at the level, it's effectively less every year. That's what has been happening for the last few years. And because of that, we are not producing enough number of postgraduates. The gross enrollment ratio in college education was only 23%. In postgraduate was even far less. So as a result, we are not producing enough number of postgraduates who will train the next generation of graduates. Yes, you are right. Unless we increase the layout, increase the number of universities, strengthen the universities, without that, we cannot really, whatever the policy even says that it will do, it cannot do. It's impossible.
There's one more question, sir, from Siddhartha only. It says, with the new policy, are we looking at more programs like TAKIP, where an underprivileged learner gets a diploma from IITs, etc., in return of a big sum of fees? Won't that negate the whole purpose?
See, in most of the European countries, especially the West European countries, they are not socialist countries, they are capitalist countries, education is free up to the highest level, PhD level. They have very good education system. Now, what we are doing is we are sort of trying to mimic the American education system, where the American parent cannot afford to get their students, get their children admitted in colleges. We are going towards that. Somebody having to be educated by paying a hefty fee is basically he or she is buying education. If that happens, the relationship between the teacher and student becomes the purchaser, the customer, and the service provider. Now, this is a very dangerous situation for education, I would say. But various programs can definitely be thought of where relatively underprivileged students can be given facilities, but not in exchange of money.
Okay, are there any more questions?
Yeah, I just have a question. So basically, I had a call to attend. So sorry if I missed some of the. I think I had a question towards me. I had missed. So I have a question for Mr. Banerjee, Professor Banerjee.
Yeah.
So when I was basically just researching even a little bit about this, it is very easily evident that public-funded countries have done well. and
Yeah.
their systems are maybe easy to copy. So why have we gone with probably the country which has probably the most faulty system? Like sometimes it is so strikingly bad that I don't really understand why have we gone that way.
Well, it is a myopic vision. It is a wrong policy. That's all I can say. This is completely wrong. India was the country when it became independent where the right policy would be to provide education to all through a government funded education. Education is a educating the next generation is a responsibility of the state. Without that, if you leave education for some private charity, then you are not doing justice to the next generation. So that is the idea that has been created through the European Renaissance long time back. Now we have gone away from that ideal, and there again I am citing the vision of the people who tried to create education in India, including Vidyasagar, who tried to create a government-funded state responsibility, state taking responsibility of education. While we have actually gone away from that, that's completely counterproductive. You're completely right.
If there are no more questions, I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
So right now we are we were 24 people here discussing national
Yeah,
education
is it
policy.
because I spoke last? I am getting all the questions. Other speakers were also there. You can ask question them also.
They are always free to answer if they feel they can.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I'd like to bring it not just specifically you. I'd want anyone to answer if they are willing to. Is that we are 16 people right now in this meeting. We were up to 24. That's the most we reached today. The meeting is being recorded anyway. We'll spread the word. But is it any good that we are discussing a policy, and I think we are all coming to a consensus that it's a bad policy to summarize. So what's the way ahead? What should we do from here?
Well, in my opinion, we should actually, I showed certain things that are said, good things about the policy. We should actually demand that this be incorporated. And in order for this to be really incorporated, many of the later things that are said in the policy will have to be abandoned, and a new policy will have to be framed. And effectively, then we have to oppose the policy that has been tabled.
I think that is what we all believe, that this is something we'll need to oppose, and given the right platform, we'll probably do that. So before we end the meeting, I'll request Rajiv Da to once summarize whatever we have discussed, and then we'll call it a day. Rajiv Da, if you are here.
Yes, a lot of thanks, sir, Professor Smith Banerjee, and also our total participants. And we are too much experienced and from this session. So we feel and tentative our experience from our interaction that the points raised against the centralization of the policy, against the privatization, commercialization, vocationalization in school level, and also the communalization in education syllabus and also language policy. So these points are already raised. So we must be, it is my observation and it is I think we must be fight against this policy, and that we must reject the policy, and we should demand to further introduce the further new policies according to the suggestions of our educationists, scientists, and also education loving people throughout nation. So from these sessions, we must be further continue our interaction in future, and at the same time, we should create a scientific, secular, democratic education system we should demand, and on this basis, we can achieve our demand and also for betterment of society. It is just our observation. Thanks to all.
Thank you, Rajibda. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. It was a fruitful discussion, in my opinion. It's just that we could have had more people. We'll try. We have the recording, and we'll try to ensure that it reaches out to as many people as we can. We'll ensure that. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us.